In the autumn of 1831, a sheriff from Sussex County rode along a narrow dirt path toward a farmhouse that had become the centre of uneasy whispers. The Holloway property stood at the edge of a dense pine forest, its fields left unworked, its fences in disrepair. For nearly a week, no smoke had risen from the chimney. The livestock wandered untended, and neighbours reported that the house remained dark long after sunset. Something was wrong. When Sheriff Elias Morton dismounted before the Holloway home, he found the doors barred from the inside. He pounded, calling out, but the silence was suffocating. Finally, he ordered men to pry the door open. What they found inside chilled them to the bone. The air was stale, thick with the smell of melted tallow and damp earth. Candles had burned low, their stubs hardened into puddles of wax along the wooden floorboards. Chairs were overturned, as though in a struggle. Deep gouges marked the dining table, and in the hearth, a fire had been allowed to die to ash. Most disturbing of all were the markings carved into the beams. Strange geometric symbols, uneven yet deliberate, scarred the wood, symbols no one present could recognize. But there were no bodies. The Holloway family, Thomas, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, were simply gone. Their clothes remained in chests. Their belongings had not been taken. Even a purse of coins sat untouched upon the mantelpiece. It was as though the family had vanished into the night, leaving behind only disorder and silence. The men who stood in that room would never forget it. Some swore they felt a presence, an unseen weight pressing on their shoulders as they searched the rooms. One deputy claimed he heard the faint sound of children's laughter from upstairs, though the rooms were empty. Others dismissed it as nerves. But when the sheriff stepped outside into the fading daylight, he nagged. You what the people of Sussex County would say, the Holloway place was haunted. And so began one of the most enduring mysteries in Delaware's dark history, the case of the Holloway family, who disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only whispers, fear, and a house that no one would willingly enter again. When word spread of the Holloways' disappearance, neighbours flocked to the farm in morbid curiosity. Few dared step inside, but those who did whispered of strange discoveries. Every room seemed to bear its own evidence of disorder, as though the family had been interrupted in the middle of their lives. On the kitchen floor lay a kettle, overturned and rusting, its contents congealed long ago. A loaf of bread, untouched, sat hardened to stone on the counter. In the children's room, dolls were scattered across the floorboards, their porcelain faces cracked. One doll, propped neatly against the wall, bore a small cross carved into its chest with a knife. No one in the Holloway family was known for carving wood. The sheriff's men also noted something odd. Every window had been latched from the inside. The doors were barred, not broken. It was as though the family had sealed themselves in, only to vanish into thin air. On the walls of the cellar, additional markings were discovered, symbols unlike the geometric ones in the dining room. These were cruder, hastily scratched into the stone foundation. Circles intersected with jagged lines, some resembling stars, others more like twisting serpents. A deputy suggested they were the idle doodles of children. Another, older man shook his head. Those aren't children's hands, he muttered. Those are protections, or warnings. Outside, in the fields, evidence was equally disturbing. Crops had been abandoned mid-harvest. Rows of corn stood half-cut, the scythes and tools still lying in place. A trail of footprints led from the back door into the woods, but they ended abruptly, swallowed by the underbrush. Some swore the prints were not all human. Adding to the unease were reports of strange sounds in the nights leading up to the discovery. One neighbour claimed to have heard wailing carried on the wind, though no funerals had been held. Another swore she saw lights moving through the Holloways' orchard at midnight, as if lanterns swung by unseen hands. All these details, scattered, contradictory, yet undeniably strange, only deepened the mystery. If the Holloways had fled, why leave money, clothing, and food behind? If they had been taken, Why were there no signs of forced entry? And what, above all, explained the symbols carved into the house itself? These questions spread quickly through Sussex County, each retelling adding a darker shade to the story. The Holloway farm was no longer just a home. It had become a riddle that by its very nature pointed towards something unearthly. Before their disappearance, the Holloways were known and unknown in Sussex County. In fact, for a time they had been respected. Thomas Holloway was a farmer of middling prosperity, descended from one of the area's earliest settlers. He was described as a tall, quiet man, with a habit of staring too long at people when they spoke, as if weighing their words in silence. His wife, Margaret, came from Maryland, and was remembered as pale, frail, and often unwell. Together, they had 3 children, 2 boys and a younger daughter, none older than 12. Neighbors recalled that the Holloways lived on the edge of things, geographically and socially. Their farm sat apart from the main road, with the pine forest encroaching close behind. They did not attend church regularly, a fact that drew suspicion in a deeply religious community. When they did appear, the family kept to themselves, rarely joining in after-service gatherings. Yet the most unsettling rumors concerned the children. Several neighbors claimed they rarely saw them outdoors, and when they did, the children appeared pale, withdrawn, and silent. One visitor recalled watching them play a peculiar game in the orchard, arranging stones in circles, humming low tunes that seemed too deliberate for children their age. When she asked them what they were doing, they stared without answering until Margaret called them inside. The Holloways' reputation grew stranger after the sudden illness of a hired hand in 1829. He had fallen sick after spending nights at the farm, insisting he heard whispers in the walls and footsteps above him when no one else was awake. He claimed Margaret gave him a draught of bitter tea that left him weak for weeks. He quit without pay and warned others never to work for Thomas again. By 1830, gossip held that the family was cursed, or worse, dabbling in forbidden practices. Some swore that Margaret came from a line of cunning women in Maryland, versed in charms and counter-charms. Others muttered that Thomas had made a bargain to keep his crops safe during a series of blights that devastated neighboring farms, while his fields remained oddly untouched. Whether these rumors had truth or not, they formed the soil in which the Holloway haunting would take root. When the family vanished, few were surprised. To many, it was simply the fulfillment of what had been whispered for years, that the Holloways were never entirely like other families, and that their end, whether by crime, curse, or covenant, was written long before it came. To understand why the disappearance of the Holloway family unsettled Sussex County so deeply, one must consider the moment in which it occurred. The year was 1831, a year heavy with tension across the young nation. That August, scarcely 2 months before the Holloways vanished, news of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia swept like wildfire through the mid-Atlantic. Fear of uprisings spread into every farmhouse, every parish, every frontier town. Delaware, perched uneasily between the free North and the slave South, felt these tremors more than most. Sussex County was rural and insular, its people bound to the land and wary of strangers. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and superstition often filled the gaps left by law or science. Families steered distillite, ecked their doors at night, not only for fear of unrest, but because they believed darker forces moved in the world after sundown. Reports of strange lights in the fields, eerie cries in the woods, or sudden illnesses blamed on witchcraft were not uncommon. It was also a place caught between eras. The Industrial Revolution was stirring in Wilmington to the north, but in Sussex, life remained closer to the old world. Small farms dotted the countryside, roads were little more than rutted dirt, and law enforcement was scarce. Sheriffs covered vast territories with few deputies, meaning most disputes were settled privately or left to fester. Justice was uneven, and many still placed more trust in charms, prayers, and rituals than in magistrates. In this climate of unease, the Holloway's disappearance struck a raw nerve. It was not merely that a family had vanished, it was the way it happened. No bodies, no sign of flight, no robbery, no clear cause. In a world primed to see signs and wonders, the Holloway case became an empty canvas onto which the fears of a community could be painted. For some, the timing itself seemed a sign. The rebellion in Virginia had already confirmed what many landholders whispered, that society was fragile, that the old order was threatened. Others insisted it was not politics but punishment. Ministers preached that the Holloways had fallen under judgment, their absence a warning to the unfaithful. And still others, quietly, told their children that the Holloways had not left at all, that they remained in the house, unseen, waiting. Thus, when neighbors spoke of the Holloway farm, they spoke not only of one family, but of the unease of an entire era. Their mystery was inseparable from the fears that gripped Delaware itself in 1831. In the Delaware of 1831, superstition was not a quaint relic of the past, it was part of daily life. Farmers who worked their fields by day still whispered of charms to keep away the witch's curse by night. A horseshoe nailed above a door, a broom laid across the threshold, or a Bible left open to the Psalms were not seen as old wives' tricks, but as necessary protections. For many, the natural and supernatural blended seamlessly. Children were warned not to wander into the woods at dusk, lest the lantern men lead them astray with flickering lights. Cows that sickened too quickly were said to be hag-ridden, drained by night spirits. Women who could cure fevers with herbs were both sought after and feared. Their remedies a fine line between healing and witchcraft. Most powerful of all were beliefs about omens. A barn owl perched on the roof meant death in the household. A sudden stillness in the forest foretold bad news. Dreams carried weight. To dream of teeth falling out was to lose a family member. To dream of twins was to invite misfortune. It was into this culture that the Holloway disappearance fell, and in many ways the case confirmed what people already believed. When neighbors saw the strange markings on the beams of the Holloway house, they were not dismissed as idle carvings, but recognized, at least in whispers, as signs. Some claimed they were counterspells meant to hold back evil. Others insisted they were marks of invitation, calling something in. The Holloway children, too, had long been the subject of muttered warnings. A neighbor swore she saw them staring into the forest at twilight, hands clasped as though in prayer to something unseen. Another claimed one child was born with a caul over her face, a membrane sometimes taken as proof of a witch mark. These tales, once dismissed as gossip, were revived with new urgency when the family vanished. Superstitions about abandoned houses only made matters worse. It was said that a dwelling left empty by death or disappearance could never be trusted. Spirits lingered, restless, unable to move on. Anyone who stepped across the Holloway threshold risked bringing that unrest home. Even those who claimed not to believe found reasons to avoid the farm. They would not drink from its well, would not cut wood from its trees, would not even let their livestock graze near its borders. By the time the sheriff filed his reports, the case was no longer simply about a missing family. To the people of Sussex County, the Holloways had become a warning, a living, or perhaps unliving, testament to the power of omens ignored. Even before their disappearance, the Holloways were a family set apart. In a community where neighbors relied on one another for survival, their reclusiveness was both notable and troubling. Thomas Holloway rarely attended meetings in town and often refused to trade except when absolutely necessary. When he did appear, his manner was curt, his eyes watchful. Margaret Holloway, by contrast, inspired pity more than fear, at least at first. She was pale and thin, often described as sickly, though no one could name her illness. Some suggested she was plagued by melancholia, others whispered she suffered from fits. A few claimed to have seen her wandering the fields at night, her hair loose, muttering words that sounded less like prayers than incantations. Whether true or not, these stories spread quickly in a county where unusual behavior was rarely forgiven. The Holloway children, too, contributed to the family's growing reputation for strangeness. They were seldom seen at school, and when they did attend, teachers described them as quiet to the point of unease. One boy was said to sit for hours staring at a single spot on the wall, unmoving, until called by name. Their younger sister reportedly drew patterns in chalk on the floorboards, shapes that some later claimed resembled the very symbols found carved into the beams of their house. Then there was the matter of their farm. While blight and rot spread through neighboring fields, the Holloways' crops seemed unnaturally resistant. Some attributed this to careful husbandry, but others suspected darker bargains. A few even claimed to see strangers at the Holloway property, travellers who arrived under cover of night and left before dawn, their faces hidden. By the late 1820s, the family had been labelled with a word no one dared say too loudly: cursed. Some neighbours avoided the path that ran near their land, choosing longer routes rather than passing too close. Others taught their children to cross themselves if they glimpsed the Holloway children watching from the orchard. So when, in 1831, the family was discovered gone, the reaction was not simple shock. For many, it felt like the fulfillment of a story already in motion, an ending that had been whispered long before it arrived. In the eyes of Sussex County, the Holloways had not just disappeared, they had been claimed. It was late October of 1831 when the first signs of unease began to stir among the Holloways' nearest neighbours. For days no smoke rose from the chimney, a detail that did not go unnoticed in a county where every household depended on the hearth for both warmth and cooking. Children fetching water from the creek remarked on the silence. No barking of dogs, no clatter of tools in the yard, no laughter or shouts from the children who were sometimes glimpsed at play. On the third night, Mary Jenkins, who lived less than a mile away, claimed she saw a flickering light in the Holloway orchard. At first she thought it was a lantern, but as she watched, the glow wavered unnaturally, like fire held aloft by invisible hands. She crossed herself and pulled her children inside. When she mentioned it the next day, her husband warned her not to repeat it. "Best leave them be," he muttered. By the end of the week, unease hardened into alarm. Livestock from the Holloway farm had begun to wander into the fields of others, gaunt from neglect. A cow was found standing in the lane, udders swollen and unmilked. The corn stood half-cut, as though the harvest had been abandoned mid-task. On the seventh night, a group of neighbours gathered at the Jenkins home to discuss the matter. Several admitted they had heard cries carried on the wind, low, wailing sounds that seemed to drift from the Holloway property but faded whenever anyone drew near. One man, emboldened by cider, swore he had heard children laughing outside his window, though when he looked, no one was there. At last, it was decided. A small posse of men would ride to the Holloway farm at first light. What they found would become the beginning of a legend. The house stood sealed, doors locked from within. Windows were shuttered tight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rustle of wind through the trees. It was then that Sheriff Elias Morton was summoned, and the decision was made to force entry. Inside, as later recorded in the sheriff's notes, the rooms bore every sign of sudden interruption. Meals half prepared, tools left scattered, furniture overturned. And yet of the family themselves, there was nothing, not a single trace. It was as though in one long October night the Holloways had simply been erased. At dawn the following morning, Sheriff Elias Morton returned to the house in Holloway farm with a dozen men at his side. Some were neighbours, others were volunteers drawn by curiosity as much as duty. They began with the house, moving room by room in silence. Though every corner was scoured, no bodies were found, no signs of departure, only the odd disorder already noted. Overturned chairs, scattered belongings, and the markings cut into wood and stone. The cellar was examined next. Lanterns cast their glow over the damp walls where strange carvings seemed to twist in the flickering light. A deputy reached out to touch one and pulled his hand away at once, insisting the stone was warm. Laughter broke the tension, but unease lingered. In the far corner of the cellar, a pile of earth had been disturbed, as though someone had begun to dig and then abandoned the task. Outside, the search spread across the farm. The barn held no livestock, only empty stalls and the faint stench of decay where animals had starved. The orchard was thick with fallen apples left to rot, buzzing with flies. Beyond the fields, a line of footprints trailed from the back porch into the woods. At first they appeared ordinary, bare human feet pressed into the damp soil. But as the men followed, the impressions grew strange. Some prints seemed too small for Thomas or his eldest boy, yet too wide for the younger children. Others curved oddly, as though toes bent backward. The trail ended abruptly less than 100 yards into the trees, swallowed by undergrowth. One of the men found a ribbon snagged on a branch, a child's pale blue torn at the edge. Another discovered a doll's head lying in the leaves, its porcelain face cracked clean down the middle. When shown to the sheriff, he pocketed it silently. The search expanded through the afternoon, with men combing the woods for miles. No graves were uncovered, no signs of violence, no evidence of flight. By dusk, the posse gathered again at the house, weary and shaken. Sheriff Morton recorded the day's findings in his log. No Holloways found, house in disorder, symbols present, possible tracks into woods, no resolution. But to the men who stood outside the Holloway house as the sun dipped low, no official record was needed. They already believed they knew the truth. Whatever had taken the Holloways, it had left no trace because it was not of this earth. In the weeks after the Holloways' disappearance, neighbors began to speak, cautiously at first, then more freely as the story took hold. Their testimonies, preserved in fragments through newspapers, diaries, and local law, painted a picture as inconsistent as it was unsettling. Mary Jenkins, the first to report strange lights in the orchard, swore she had seen figures moving among the trees the very night the family was last heard from. Not men, she insisted, but shadows, longer than men, bending wrong in the moonlight. She claimed she heard children's laughter carried on the breeze, though the Holloway children had not been seen outdoors for days. Another neighbor, Samuel Dent, testified that he had been awakened by the sound of dogs howling in the distance. When he stepped outside, he saw lanterns moving up the lane toward the Holloway farm. Yet when he walked part way to investigate, the lights vanished all at once. He returned home uneasy, and in the morning found his own chickens dead in their coop, their necks unbroken, but their eyes clouded white. More practical voices offered different accounts. One man claimed he saw strangers riding through the county days before the vanishing, rough-looking men he took for drifters. He suggested bandits had taken the family and left their home in disorder to frighten off pursuit. But others dismissed this theory, pointing out the untouched coins on the mantel and the food left to rot. "Robbers don't leave money behind," an old farmer muttered. Perhaps most chilling was the statement of a young girl named Rebecca Miles. Barely 10 years old, she told her mother that on the night of the storm she had dreamed of the Holloway children. In her dream they stood in a circle, hands joined, chanting words she could not understand. When she awoke, she claimed to see them standing at the foot of her bed, pale and silent, before vanishing like mist. Her mother, shaken, refused to let her repeat the story in court. The sheriff dutifully recorded what he could, but he admitted privately that the testimonies only muddied the truth. Bandits, witches, spirits, or dreams. Each account seemed to point in a different direction. Yet one detail returned again and again, no matter who spoke. The Holloway house had felt heavy, oppressive, even before the family vanished, as though some unseen presence had been waiting all along. Sheriff Elias Morton, though deeply unsettled by what he had seen inside the Holloway home, was a practical man. His duty was not to entertain ghost stories or omens, but to find a missing family. In his official report he avoided mention of strange lights, laughter in empty rooms, or symbols carved into beams. Instead he wrote plainly, "House in disorder, family unaccounted for, possible abduction or flight." The first theory Morton pursued was that of banditry. Sussex County was no stranger to drifters, runaways, debtors, and outlaws who found refuge in the dense pine woods. Perhaps, he reasoned, the Holloways had been taken by force, their captors vanishing into the night with them. Yet the evidence would not cooperate. No valuables had been stolen. No neighbors reported hearing wagons or horses. And why, if robbers were to blame, had the doors been locked from within? Another possibility was flight. Families burdened with debt sometimes abandoned their land, vanishing into new territories under assumed names. But again, the facts contradicted the idea. The Holloways had not been destitute. Their farm was productive, their tools and animals in good order until the disappearance. Their coins remained in plain sight, untouched. Even their Sunday clothes were still hanging neatly in the chest upstairs. Morton briefly considered murder. Perhaps one member of the family had turned against the others, and in the aftermath, taken his own life in the woods. The disturbed earth in the cellar seemed suggestive of burial, though no bodies were found. Still, the absence of bloodstains or weapons, combined with the total disappearance of all 5 members, made this explanation tenuous at best. Behind closed doors, deputies whispered about darker possibilities. One suggested witchcraft, that the family had been practicing forbidden rites, and that something had claimed them as payment. Morton dismissed the talk publicly, but privately he admitted the symbols cut into the cellar stone troubled him. He even sent a sketch of them to a clergyman in Wilmington, asking if they resembled anything biblical. The reply, weeks later, was unnerving in its brevity. These are not Christian marks. Unable to produce a solution, the sheriff filed the case as unresolved, but his failure to explain only fed speculation. In the absence of a rational cause, the people of Sussex County supplied their own. Ministers thundered from pulpits, neighbors whispered in taverns, and soon the Holloway case would pass from the realm of law into that of legend. In a county where church bells marked the rhythm of life, it was inevitable that the disappearance of the Holloway family would be drawn into the pulpit. Within days of the sheriff's report, ministers throughout Sussex County seized upon the mystery as a warning from God. At St. Paul's Chapel, Reverend Josiah Harker thundered before a packed congregation that the Holloways had been struck down for abandoning their faith. They forsook the Sabbath, they shunned the flock, and they hid themselves in shadows, he proclaimed. And in their secrecy, the Lord found them guilty. His words echoed far beyond the chapel walls, repeated by parishioners who whispered them over supper tables and at market stalls. Other ministers leaned even harder on Scripture. The carvings in the Holloway house were likened to the marks of Cain, a visible sign of sin. The family's sudden vanishing was compared to the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed not by human hands, but by divine fire. One preacher claimed the absence of bodies proved their souls had been swept into the pit, leaving nothing for mortals to bury. To a fearful people, these explanations offered both comfort and condemnation. Comfort, because they suggested God's justice, however terrible, was still in control. Condemnation, because if the Holloways were judged, then others might be as well. Parents began warning their children not to stray from worship, lest they too be taken in the night. Not all agreed with the minister's conclusions, of course. Some quietly questioned whether divine punishment explained the ribbons, the dolls, the footprints that led into the woods, but few dared voice their doubts publicly. In a time of unrest, it was safer to nod than to challenge the men of the cloth. And so the Holloways became less a family than a parable. Their disappearance was told and retold not as tragedy, but as lesson, the wages of isolation, of secrecy, of turning away from the church. Whether true or not mattered little. The story took on a life of its own, a sermon that required no ending. Yet outside the chapels, in taverns and farmhouses, another interpretation was brewing. Not divine wrath, but human evil, or perhaps something darker still, was to blame. It would not be long before the newspapers took notice. By November of 1831, the Holloway case had leapt from whispered rumour to printed word. Local editors, hungry for copy that would stir both curiosity and fear, devoted columns to the disappearance. The Delaware Gazette ran the first piece, a cautious notice titled, "A Family Missing in Sussex." The report mentioned the abandoned house, the missing members, and the sheriff's inconclusive search. But even this brief account struck readers with unease. A family of 5, gone without trace, their hearth cold and their fields left to ruin. Within weeks, other papers seized upon the story. The Wilmington Journal reprinted the facts with flourishes, adding that strange marks of unknown origin had been found on the beams of the Holloway dwelling. The Baltimore Patriot pushed it further still, describing symbols of pagan rite, drawn in trembling hand upon the stone walls. Each retelling magnified the horror. One Philadelphia paper speculated openly that the Holloways had been taken by a band of foreign gypsies who preyed upon isolated farms. Another suggested they had fled in shame after discoveries of unnatural practices were made against them. No evidence supported either claim, but evidence mattered little in the competitive world of print. The Holloways were no longer flesh and blood. They were headlines. Perhaps most striking was the Georgetown Sentinel, whose editor visited the farm himself. In his column, he wrote of standing in the cellar, staring at the carvings by lantern light. "I felt," he wrote, "as though I were not alone, though no sound was heard save the dripping of water through stone." He declared the property cursed and urged readers never to set foot there. The effect on Sussex County was immediate. Strangers began arriving, curious to glimpse the infamous Holloway farm. Some came from as far as Maryland and Pennsylvania, lured by what they had read. Farmers complained of trespassers cutting across their land. Ministers fumed that the press traded in fear for profit, but secretly, even they read the articles with morbid fascination. By the year's end, the Holloway story had traveled far beyond Delaware. It was no longer a local mystery, but a regional legend. And as it spread, it changed. With each retelling, the details shifted. Symbols became runes, lights became fires, whispers became screams. The truth, if there ever had been one, was swallowed by ink and rumor. By the winter of 1831, the Holloway disappearance was no longer treated merely as a crime or mystery. It had ripened into something darker, a curse. Farmers warned their children not to speak the family's name after sundown, lest the Holloways hear and come calling. The property itself was avoided, as though invisible boundaries had been drawn around it. Travellers cut wide circles around the farm lane, claiming their horses balked at the road that led to the house. Soon, stories began to spread that anyone who entered the Holloway dwelling would suffer misfortune. One tale told of a man who stole an iron pot from the kitchen, only to fall dead within a week. Another spoke of a boy who dared carve his initials into the barn door. He was later found drowned in the mill pond. These accounts were rarely confirmed, but in a community already steeped in superstition, they required no proof. The telling alone gave them weight. The family themselves, though unseen, were said to linger. Some whispered that Thomas Holloway had made a pact with forces beyond human comprehension, and when the debt came due, it claimed not only him, but his wife and children as well. Margaret, pale and frail in life, became in legend a spectral figure who wandered the orchard at night, her face hidden beneath a white veil. The children were said to be heard in the woods, giggling just out of sight, their laughter curdling into cries if one strayed too close. The curse took root in language too. Neighbours coined phrases: Holloway's silence for an empty house, Holloway's mark for a child born with a deformity. The name became shorthand for calamity, a way to explain what could not be explained. Crops that failed, storms that came unseasonably, sickness that claimed a household, these could be traced, if one stretched far enough, back to the Holloways. And like all curses, it fed upon fear. The more people spoke of it, the more powerful it seemed. Rational explanations, banditry, illness, flight, faded from memory. What endured was the belief that the Holloways had been swallowed by something greater than death, and that the shadow of their fate still stretched across Sussex County. Thus, the Holloway curse became not just a story of one family, but a mirror for every unspoken dread that haunted the people of Delaware in the early 19th century. Of all the stories that grew from the Holloway disappearance, none unsettled the people of Sussex County more than those surrounding the children. Adults might vanish into debt or disgrace, but children, innocent, helpless, were not meant to simply disappear. Their absence left a hole that neighbors filled with whispers of spectral return. It was said that the Holloway children never truly left the farm. Farmers working the fields nearby reported hearing giggles carried on the wind, thin and high, only to find themselves standing alone. Others claimed to glimpse small figures moving between the apple trees in the orchard, darting just out of sight. Lantern light would reveal nothing, but the sensation of being watched lingered. One of the earliest accounts came from a miller named Daniel Cross, who swore he saw 3 children standing at the edge of the woods while he returned home at dusk. They stood in a line, he later recounted, their faces pale as chalk, their eyes dark as coals. I called out, thinking them lost, but when I blinked, they were gone. Cross, a hardened man, refused to pass the Holloway property again without company. Stories of the children multiplied as the years passed. A girl gathering firewood near the farm swore one of the Holloway boys approached her, barefoot, asking if she would play. When she screamed, he vanished into the trees. Another tale spoke of a traveller who lodged in a farmhouse a mile away. In the dead of night, he was woken by the sound of children's feet pattering across the roof. When he rushed outside, the yard was empty, yet the prints of bare feet appeared in the frost upon the shingles. Perhaps most chilling were the accounts of their laughter. Unlike the mournful wails sometimes attributed to spirits, the Holloway children were said to laugh, softly at first, then louder, until it twisted into a sound almost inhuman. Those who heard it claimed it did not fade with distance, but seemed to circle them, closing in. By the 1840s, mothers warned their children not to wander near the Holloway farm at dusk. To hear the Holloway children laugh, it was said, was to invite one's own disappearance. The children, once barely seen in life, had become the most feared spectres of the Holloway legend, symbols of innocence transformed into lingering menace. What began as a local calamity soon became a tale told far beyond the borders of Sussex County. By the mid-1830s, travellers moving along the post roads carried word of the Holloway disappearance into taverns and marketplaces across Delaware and into Maryland and Pennsylvania. Each retelling grew more elaborate, each teller adding their own flourish until the family's fate became less history than legend. In Georgetown, merchants warned strangers about the house where God would not stay. In Wilmington, sailors claimed to hear Holloway voices on the wind when fog rolled up the Delaware Bay. Even in Philadelphia, far to the north, newspapers occasionally referenced the cursed family of Delaware when describing unexplained calamities. The legend began to shift in tone as it spread. Some versions cast the Holloways as victims of witchcraft, innocent souls ensnared by darker neighbors who envied their prosperous farm. Others painted them as practitioners themselves, struck down when their bargains collapsed. Still others, more fantastical, claimed the entire family had been swallowed by the earth, dragged underground by spirits who punished the prideful. As often happens with folklore, the truth mattered little. What mattered was the lesson. To some, the Holloways represented the dangers of turning from faith. To others, they were a warning against isolation, proof that those who cut themselves off from community would be consumed. To still others, especially children raised on the stories, they were simply figures of fear, shadows in the orchard, who might call your name at dusk. The legend also acquired rituals of its own. By the 1840s, local boys dared one another to approach the Holloway house and scratch their initials on its door. Some whispered that if you left a toy in the orchard overnight, it would be gone by morning, taken by the Holloway children who still played there. Few were brave enough to test the theory. Thus, the story of one family became part of Delaware's shared folklore, woven into the fabric of its haunted past. And as the decades rolled forward, the Holloways were no longer remembered as flesh-and-blood neighbors, but as symbols of what happens when mystery and fear take root in the imagination of a people. Among all the unsettling details of the Holloway case, none drew more fascination or fear than the markings found carved into the beams of the farmhouse and scrawled along the cellar walls. Sheriff Morton's men described them plainly in their reports. Circles intersected with jagged lines, triangles overlapping, crude stars, and serpentine shapes that curled like coiled ropes. To some, they appeared childish. To others, they were evidence of something far more sinister. Neighbors who dared step inside the house after the disappearance swore the symbols were not random at all. They had purpose, one man told a newspaper editor. Not the idle scratches of boys with knives, but drawings made to bind or call something. A midwife who examined the cellar insisted the markings resembled protective charms, counter-hexes she had seen etched into barn doors to keep witches away. Others disagreed, arguing they looked more like invitations, symbols designed to summon what should not be called. The most disturbing account came from Reverend Harker, who was shown a sketch of the carvings. His reaction was immediate and stern. "These are not the signs of God," he declared from his pulpit. "They are the language of the pit." He warned his flock never to look upon them again, lest their meaning stain the soul. Modern folklorists who later studied descriptions of the symbols suggested they might have been part of a broader tradition of Pennsylvania Dutch hex signs, symbols meant to protect farms from misfortune, circles for eternity, stars for good fortune, serpents for warding off sickness. Yet even these scholars admitted the patterns found in the Holloway cellar seemed distorted, as though someone had copied them poorly or twisted them into something darker. Local law went further still. By the 1850s, it was said that anyone who lingered too long in the Holloway cellar would begin to see the carvings shift in the lantern light, the lines bending and writhing as though alive. A tale circulated of a man who tried to chisel one away, only to have his tool snap in two. He fled the farm in terror, swearing that as he ran, he heard the sound of children laughing behind him. The symbols became the heart of the Holloway legend, a silent language carved in wood and stone, speaking of forces no one in Sussex County wished to name aloud. And though the house eventually collapsed with time, the memory of those marks endured, etched not just into beams, but into the fearful imagination of all who heard the tale. As stories of the Holloway disappearance spread, one theory gained a disturbing foothold, that the family had been taken, or had taken themselves, through ritual sacrifice. It was not a conclusion born of evidence, but of fear, rumor, and the ever-present suspicion of witchcraft that clung to isolated households. The symbols carved into the cellar walls seemed to feed the idea. To some, they looked less like charms of protection and more like diagrams of summoning. Circles within circles, stars jagged and incomplete, crude serpents curling endlessly. It was easy, in the lantern's flicker, to imagine them as tools of an unholy rite. The half-dug patch of earth in the cellar corner added to the whispers. Was it meant for burial, or had it been used already as part of a ceremony too dreadful to name? A few claimed that the Holloways had consorted with itinerant cunning folk who drifted between Delaware and Maryland, selling charms, powders, and forbidden books. One tale insisted that Thomas Holloway had purchased a volume of grimoires, using it to draw prosperity to his fields while blight consumed his neighbors. When payment came due, the story went, he and his family were taken in body, though not in spirit. Others turned their suspicion on Margaret. Her pale, sickly frame and reclusive nature made her an easy scapegoat. Some whispered she was descended from a Maryland woman tried for witchcraft a generation earlier. That the Holloway children were rarely seen outside only fueled speculation. Perhaps they were not hidden for protection, but because they were marked by some covenant. The most lurid stories claimed the family had gathered in their cellar the night they vanished, performing a ritual that went wrong. The lights seen in the orchard, the laughter heard on the wind, these were, according to such accounts, echoes of that final ceremony, a summoning that opened a door which swallowed the Holloways whole. By the 1840s, these sacrificial theories had woven themselves into local folklore. Preachers denounced them as devil's tales, yet repeated them all the same. Parents warned children never to carve symbols in wood or play games in circles, lest they mimic what the Holloways had done. Whether believed or not, the very suggestion of ritual sacrifice ensured that the Holloways' fate was never seen as merely human. It was something darker, and it cast a shadow over Sussex County that would not lift for generations. In the months following the Holloways' disappearance, unease did not remain contained within their farm. It spilled outward, attaching itself to others in Sussex County who seemed different, isolated, or simply unfortunate. As often happened in times of fear, the unknown was explained by pointing fingers. The first whispers targeted Margaret's family in Maryland. Old rumors resurfaced that her grandmother had been accused of witchcraft in Dorchester County decades earlier, though no records survived to prove it. For some, this supposed legacy was evidence enough. Witchcraft ran in the bloodline, and Margaret had carried it north into Delaware. A local widow who had been friendly with her soon found herself shunned, accused of keeping the same company. But suspicion did not stop there. Other women in the county, particularly those known for herbal remedies, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. A midwife named Annabel Price, long respected for easing childbirth pains with teas and salves, became a subject of gossip after she admitted once visiting the Holloway farm. When cattle sickened that winter, neighbors muttered her name. She was never formally charged with anything, but families stopped calling upon her services, and she died in poverty within a few years. Even children were not spared the weight of accusation. A boy who lived near the Holloways was said to have played with their youngest daughter, and when he later fell into fits of night terrors, his family was accused of harboring her spirit. Doors closed to them, and though they remained in the county, their reputation never recovered. Ministers, eager to reinforce their sermons about judgment, leaned into the rumors. Some declared that witchcraft was abroad in the land, and that the Holloway case was proof of its reach. Tales of spectral children and symbols carved in wood were woven into Sunday warnings, blurring the line between scripture and folklore. Yet beneath the accusations lay something simpler: fear. The Holloways had vanished without explanation, and the human mind cannot bear a void. It demands cause, culprit, meaning. In a place where superstition held as much power as law, witchcraft was the most ready answer. The tragedy of the Holloways was thus magnified, for their absence not only haunted the county, but poisoned it. Friendships frayed, families fractured, and those who lived on its edges paid the price. In vanishing, the Holloways had left behind more than a mystery. They had left behind a community desperate to explain them, even if it meant turning against itself. Nearly a century after the Holloways vanished, the mystery seemed destined to remain a matter of folklore. The farmhouse had long since collapsed into ruin, its timbers scavenged for barns and sheds. Only the stone foundation lingered, half swallowed by weeds. But in 1928, a discovery would breathe new life into the tale. During renovations of an old house in Georgetown, workers unearthed a leather-bound journal wedged behind a false wall. The book was brittle, its ink faded, but enough remained legible to capture immediate attention. Inside were entries dated between 1829 and 1831, written in a hand later identified as belonging to a man named Henry Cartwright, a travelling schoolmaster who had briefly lodged with the Holloways. Cartwright's observations were unsettling. He described Thomas Holloway as a man with shadows in his eyes, given to long silences and sudden bursts of temper. Margaret he painted as delicate but secretive, often seen in the orchard at night, tracing patterns in the soil by lantern light. Most disturbing were his notes on the children. He claimed they rarely spoke in his presence, yet he often heard them whispering to one another in what he called a language not known to me, nor to their parents, I think. The final entries were the most haunting. In September 1831, Cartwright wrote of strange gatherings at the Holloway farm. 3 times this month, he noted, I have witnessed figures approaching after midnight, their faces obscured. The family welcomed them indoors, and chants continued until dawn. I cannot in good conscience remain here. His last dated entry, October 21st, read simply, Something is coming. I hear it in the children's voices. The journal caused a sensation when it was donated to the Delaware Historical Society. Newspapers across the state revisited the Holloway story, reviving interest in a mystery that had lain dormant for nearly 100 years. To skeptics, the journal was evidence of Cartwright's paranoia, nothing more. To others, it was proof that the Holloways had been engaged in rituals leading up to their disappearance. Whatever its truth, the journal ensured that the Holloways would not rest quietly in forgotten lore. Their story returned to the public eye, and once more, Sussex County whispered of the family that had vanished into silence. The discovery of Henry Cartwright's journal in 1928 did more than stir newspaper headlines. It drew the attention of folklorists, men and women who travelled the countryside collecting oral histories and forgotten tales. To them, the Holloway mystery was not merely a story of one family, but a cultural echo, an enduring legend that revealed how communities wrestled with fear, faith, and the unknown. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration sent field workers across Delaware to gather folklore as part of its federal writers' project. Among the stories preserved were multiple accounts of the Holloways. Elderly residents, some claiming descent from the very neighbors who had witnessed the aftermath, recalled details not found in official records. One woman told of her grandmother hearing children sin, jing in the orchard long after the family was gone. Another man remembered that his grandfather had refused to harvest apples near the Holloway property, declaring them tainted with the dead. Folklorists also examined church records, finding sermons from 1831 and 1832 that thundered against witchcraft and judgment, thinly veiled references to the Holloways. In private letters, preserved in attics and trunks, they uncovered mentions of neighbors who believed the family had been taken whole or swallowed by the earth. These fragments, though inconsistent, built a mosaic of fear and fascination. By mid-century, academic interest had turned the Holloways into more than folklore. Papers were presented at historical societies, framing the story as an example of how superstition shaped rural life. Some scholars argued the family's fate revealed anxieties about isolation in frontier communities. Others suggested it reflected deeper racial and religious tensions simmering in Delaware at the time. Yet even as researchers wrote with academic detachment, they admitted to unease when visiting the ruins of the Holloway farm. One folklorist, writing in 1946, confessed, "I stood in what remains of the cellar and felt watched, though no birds sang and no wind stirred. The stones seemed to hum faintly, as if remembering." Thus, the Holloway case lived on not only as gossip or rumor, but as recorded folklore, archived in libraries, preserved in field notes, and whispered into tape recorders. What began as a tragedy in 1831 had, by the 20th century, become a lasting legend, woven tightly into Delaware's haunted history. In the summer of 1953, nearly 120 years after the Holloways' disappearance, a farmer ploughing a field near the old property struck something solid. At first he thought it a tree root, but when the earth was cleared, bones emerged, small, fragile, unmistakably human. Authorities were summoned, and over the following weeks, several shallow graves were uncovered along the edge of the woods. The remains were badly degraded, but it was clear they had been buried without coffins. In 2 graves, the skeletons were of children, their bones no larger than twigs. Another, larger skeleton was found with its arms crossed over its chest in what some interpreted as a hurried, makeshift burial. No grave markers, no records, no memory remained of who these people had been. Local speculation erupted at once. Many insisted the bodies were those of the Holloways themselves, proof at last of what had become of the family. But the state pathologist, after examining the remains, noted that the bones were likely far older than 1831, possibly even from colonial times. Yet such a conclusion did little to quiet the rumors. To the community, science could not erase the haunting proximity. The Holloway farm and its ghosts lay only a few yards away. Folklore quickly absorbed the discovery. Some said the children's bones belonged to playmates lured by the Holloway brood into their games of circles and chanting. Others whispered the Holloways had offered them in sacrifice, their graves left as evidence of forbidden rites. Still others claimed the burials were punishment, that when the family was taken, their bodies were cast into the ground, hidden where they would never find rest. Even practical minds were disturbed. Farmers refused to plough near the graves again, claiming their horses grew skittish and refused to walk over the soil. A hunter swore his dog howled each time they passed the site, hair bristling though nothing stirred in the trees. By the end of the decade, the land was abandoned, left to grow wild. Whether colonial remains or the Holloways themselves, the graves deepened the mystery rather than solved it. The earth had given up bones, but not truth. And in Sussex County, the discovery was remembered less as archaeology than as proof that the Holloway curse remained buried just beneath the soil, waiting. By the 1970s, the Holloway story had shifted from whispered folklore to a subject of fascination for a new kind of seeker: paranormal investigators. Ghost hunting societies, often made up of amateur enthusiasts with tape recorders and cameras, began to visit the overgrown ruins of the Holloway farm. What they claimed to find only deepened the legend. The Delaware Paranormal Research Society conducted one of the earliest formal investigations in 1974. Setting up camp near the Cellar Foundation, they recorded hours of audio. On several tapes, faint sounds were later reported: childlike giggles, the tapping of feet on wood where no floorboards remained, and a woman's voice murmuring indistinctly. Skeptics dismissed the recordings as wind or equipment failure, but to believers, they were undeniable evidence of the Holloways' lingering presence. Other groups followed. In the 1980s, a team carrying infrared cameras reported sudden drops in temperature around the cellar, their instruments showing pockets of cold that moved independently of the night air. A photograph from that same session revealed, according to them, the outline of 3 figures standing in the orchard, small, childlike shapes with blurred faces. Local teenagers, drawn by dares and bravado, added their own accounts. Some claimed to hear children laughing in the fields. Others reported finding their names scratched faintly into stones after spending the night nearby. One boy swore he saw a pale woman at the edge of the woods, her face covered by a veil of hair. He fled and never returned. Even seasoned ghost hunters admitted unease. A well-known investigator who visited the site in the 1990s described the Cellar Foundation as the heaviest place I've ever stood. The air felt thick, as though someone, or something, was pressing down on my chest. He claimed that when he spoke the Holloways' names aloud, his flash, light went dark for nearly a full minute before sputtering back to life. Not every claim could be verified, of course. Critics argued that most experiences were the product of suggestion, fueled by the powerful grip of local legend. Yet even skeptics conceded one thing: people who visited the Holloway site rarely left unmoved. Whether by imagination or something unseen, they came away convinced that the Holloways had never truly departed. Thus the legend endured, not confined to the 19th century, but alive in modern memory, its echoes recorded not only in folklore, but in static-filled tapes, grainy photographs, and shivering human testimony. As the Holloway legend grew, so too did the efforts of historians and skeptics to strip away its supernatural layers. In their view, the disappearance of the Holloways was not evidence of curses or spirits, but the result of more earthly causes: poverty, violence, or flight. One of the most common theories proposed that the family simply abandoned their farm. The early 1830s were years of economic hardship, and families across the mid-Atlantic sometimes slipped away in the night, seeking new lives under assumed names. Supporters of this idea point to the Holloways' relative isolation and Thomas's reputed bitterness toward neighbors as signs that he might have chosen a fresh start, far from Sussex County. The trouble, of course, lies in the locked doors and unfinished meals, details that make such an escape difficult to reconcile. Another theory suggests foul play at the hands of outsiders. Bandit raids were not unknown in rural Delaware, and the Holloway farm, isolated and productive, might have been a tempting target. Yet the lack of theft puzzled even contemporaries. Why would criminals abduct an entire family, but leave coins, tools, and animals behind? Some researchers have turned suspicion inward, proposing that Thomas Holloway himself may have killed his family and then vanished into the woods. The disturbed patch of cellar earth could have been the beginning of a grave he abandoned. But without bodies or blood, this remains only speculation. A darker interpretation views the Holloways through the lens of mental illness. Margaret's rumoured fits, the children's strange behaviour, and the odd carvings in the home could point to shared delusions or disorders that spiralled into tragedy. Perhaps the family retreated deeper and deeper into paranoia until something, suicide, starvation, or a desperate flight, consumed them. Skeptics of the supernatural explanations argue that folklore has simply filled in the blanks left by poor records. Stories of ghostly children, shifting symbols, and ritual chants, they suggest, are embellishments born of fear and retelling. Every generation adds its own shadows, one historian wrote. The Holloways are not spectres, but victims of our imagination. Yet even those who push for rational answers admit an uncomfortable truth. No theory, no matter how grounded, explains all the details. The locked house, the suddenness of the disappearance, the eerie persistence of the legend, all resist tidy solutions. And so, the Holloways remain suspended between fact and folklore, caught in the uneasy space where history ends and myth begins. Today, nearly 2 centuries after the family vanished, the Holloways remain a fixture of Delaware's haunted landscape. Their story is told not only in hushed voices at kitchen tables, but in brochures for ghost tours, in campfire tales, and in books of folklore that sit on library shelves across the state. Visitors who travel to Sussex County often find themselves directed, quietly, toward the patch of land where the Holloway farm once stood. Though little remains beyond the faint outline of a cellar foundation hidden by weeds, guides and storytellers, assure audiences that the ground still holds power. Some speak of cold winds that rise suddenly in the orchard. Others promise that, if you linger long enough, you may hear the laughter of unseen children drifting from the woods. The legend has also seeped into popular culture. Paranormal television programs have aired segments on the Holloways, treating the mystery as one of Delaware's most enduring ghost stories. Authors of Gothic fiction borrow elements of the tale: vanished families, cursed farms, spectral children, though often without crediting its origins. Even local businesses have leaned on the story, with inns and taverns naming drinks after the Holloway curse. For the people of Sussex County, however, the legend carries a weight beyond entertainment. To some, it remains a cautionary tale about isolation and secrecy. To others, it is a parable about divine judgment. For still others, especially the young, it is simply a source of fascination, proof that their quiet fields and pine woods are not so ordinary after all. What makes the Holloway case endure is not certainty, but absence. The lack of answers leaves space for imagination, and in that space, fear grows. Whether one believes the family fled, was murdered, or was taken by forces beyond this world, the power of the story lies in its refusal to be resolved. And so, the Holloways live on, not in flesh, but in memory. A family lost to history, yet found in every retelling. Their legacy is a silence that has spoken for nearly 200 years, a silence that continues to echo across Delaware's fields and through the imaginations of all who hear their name. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Holloways were last seen, and still their absence lingers like a wound that will not close. The orchard is gone, the farmhouse collapsed, the stones of the cellar scattered and overgrown. Time has reclaimed the land, yet the story refuses to fade. Perhaps that is the true power of the Holloway mystery. Not the symbols or the testimonies, or even the bones unearthed in shallow graves, but the silence at its center. No resolution, no body, no truth to hold on to. Just a void, and into that void, generation after generation has poured its fears. Witches, curses, rituals, restless spirits. Each telling reflects less about the Holloways themselves and more about those who cannot bear a story without an ending. And yet, the Holloways endure. Their name drifts through newspapers, church sermons, ghost tours, and whispered tales told to children after dark. They live on as shadows in the orchard, as laughter in the woods, as warnings carved into the imagination of Delaware. In the end, they may be less a family than a mirror, reflecting back our own unease with death, mystery, and the unknowable. It is said that if you stand where the farmhouse once stood, you can feel the weight of the land pressing in. Some claim they hear the faint echo of children's feet in the leaves, or see a pale figure drifting at the tree line, watching. Whether these are tricks of the mind or remnants of something that once was, no one can say. But perhaps that uncertainty is the very thing that keeps the Holloways with us. And so, the silence of 1831 has never ended. It stretches forward, binding past to present, ensuring that the Holloways remain not just a story of Sussex County, but a legend that belongs to us all. Maybe, late at night when the world is quiet, you'll think of the Holloways too. And if you do, listen carefully, because silence often has more to say than words.